Welcome APUSH students to Unit 7 Review Part 2, 1890 to 1945. This thing is 17% of the exam. It is enormous, so make sure you guys know this unit well. Now, again, a little overview. We're going all the way back from the annexation of Hawaii. We go through the Progressive Era. We go into World War I. We have the interwar period where we have the Roaring Twenties. We have the Great Depression. Then we get into the New Deal. And finally, World War II with ending with the Yalta Conference and the bombing of Japan.
Came up and he was gone with the draft. He's in the army now, a-blowing.
Let's start off with Native Americans during Unit 7. A big deal that happens here is the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924. Now, we've seen African Americans become citizens at this point, or up to this point. We've seen poor people get to vote. We've seen all these movements where America is becoming more inclusive. And Native Americans are kind of the last people to become citizens in America. Now, there are some theories as to why the government makes Native citizens in 1924. Among them are the fact that the continental United States, all the land that the U.S. wants that the Natives had, is now conquered, so they no longer need to declare war on Natives. They also passed the Revenue Act, right? So in 1924, so now America's collecting taxes, and so they think, hey, if we make Native citizens, those Natives will have to pay taxes. So there is that going on as well. Now, you should also know about the Navajo code talkers in World War II. Now, Navajo language is only spoken by Navajo people, obviously, at this time. And so the U.S. military is going to use Navajo Native Americans and their oral language as a code in World War II. And it is the only oral code to never be broken at this time. They're also going to send a lot of these Navajo guys out to very dangerous parts of the world during World War II, so they're often seen as heroes. We also have the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934. This is going to give Natives self-government on their reservations. It's often called the Indian New Deal. And this is basically telling Natives, you're no longer wardens of the state. You guys have your own reservations. You can do whatever you want. We're not going to try to assimilate you anymore. And again, if you look at this timing, this is in the midst of the Great Depression. So this is the U.S. saying, hey, we don't have the money to run boarding schools and try to get Natives to assimilate to our culture, so let's give them some independence so we don't have to pay those costs anymore. So know that Native Americans are going to gain some citizenship. They're going to help out in World War I and World War II, and they're going to start getting reservations instead of assimilation.
Came up and he was gone with the draft. He's in the army now, a-blowing.
Unit 7 is an excellent time for women in America. We see the 19th Amendment passed in 1920, which finally gives women the right to vote on a national level. Now, a few states, actually most states at this time, had passed laws that allowed women to vote, but it takes all the way up till 1920 for America to give women that right of suffrage, or the right to vote in national elections. Because women get this right to vote, they form this league called the League of Women Voters, and this is made to inform women on politics and what's happening in the political spectrum of America. We also see work beginning to rise at this time, definitely during World War I and II. You guys may know Rosie the Riveter. This is the real-life Rosie right here, but she becomes a symbol of women empowerment. The government is going to make this poster to encourage women to come out into the workforce and fill in for all those men fighting in World War II. We see women starting to get an education at this time. This is due to new technology that we have in the home, things like vacuums and laundry machines. So women have a little bit more independence and time to get out of the house and go work. They're also working in new industries like as operators or as secretaries, so women are definitely gaining that independence. Now, if you are a woman and you're working and you get married, you're expected to go back to being a domestic servant to your husband during this time, so keep that in mind. And women who worked in factories during World War I and II were also expected to go back to the kitchen after the wars were over, okay? They're supposed to leave these factory roles and they're supposed to go back to being domestic servants. So women do gain a little bit of rights and they get a little bit of involvement in the economy, but it'll get taken away again after World War I and II.
Came up and he was gone with the draft. He's in the army now, a-blowing.
African Americans in Unit 7 are going to continue to have a very difficult time. We see the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement for Colored People, form in 1909. Now, this organization is formed to protect blacks from the violence that's happening in the Jim Crow South. So that is the point of the NAACP. Nowadays, it is more of a kind of a watchdog for racial issues in America. We also see a new organization called the Universal Negro Improvement Association, the UNIA. That is going to be formed by Marcus Garvey, and it is all about black pride. He talks about going back to Africa and forming a black nation, that blacks don't need whites to be successful, and I like to think of it as kind of like a pseudo Black Panthers movement, kind of, where they're both pushing for assimilation and kind of we should form our own culture as blacks and break away from American white culture. Now, with this violent Jim Crow laws in the South, you guys will remember that there is a massive amount of lynchings down here in the South of blacks, and that is going to cause the Great Migration that happens between 1910 and 1930. Blacks in these Jim Crow rural South areas, they have no economic options, they can't really get jobs, they're stuck sharecropping, things like that, and so they're going to flee the South and go to urban cities up in the north like Pittsburgh, Chicago, all those kind of places, so know about that Great Migration. We also have the Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s, which is an explosion of black art and culture that's going to happen in Harlem. Think Langston Hughes, you probably read him in your English class. There's jazz, things like that. So know about the Harlem Renaissance. And then finally, during World War II, we have the Double V campaign movement. This is where blacks say, hey, we're willing to fight against the Nazis in Germany and in Europe, but we want a victory at home as well. If we fight in America's war, we should be treated like real American heroes. Now, sadly enough, the Double V campaign does not achieve its goals. Many blacks will come back from Europe, they'll go to Georgia, they'll go back home to Tennessee, Alabama, and they will be treated as second-class citizens, even though they risked their lives, often leading charges in World War II. So very sad for African American vets in World War I and II.
Came up and he was gone with the draft. He's in the army now, a-blowing.
Immigration and foreigners in Unit 7. Let's start off with the Emergency Quota Act of 1921. This is the first act that's going to limit the number of immigrants coming into America based on kind of a numerical value. Okay. That is going to be backed up by the Immigration Act of 1924, which is to keep out those new immigrants. We've talked about these new immigrants in past videos. These guys are your Poles, they're your Romanians, those kind of like Slavic, Southern European countries. So, or East and Southern European countries. So they establish a quota in the Immigration Act of 2% to keep out those new immigrants. Now, this act is supported by the KKK. They're supported by the nativists, which you should know are anti-immigration, kind of trying to keep America pure of these foreign influences. So know those two groups as well. Now, in 1942, we're also going to have the Bracero program, and what this is American men are off fighting in World War II, and we need laborers to come and harvest the crops in California in the Midwest. So they allow Mexican immigrants to come into the U.S. Under kind of a temporary visa, and they get 30 cents an hour to harvest crops in California, and then they are shipped back to Mexico after they are done harvesting. So a very controversial program at the time, but know about that Bracero program.
Came up and he was gone with the draft. He's in the army now, a-blowin'.
As far as technology goes, we see Henry Ford and his new Model T being produced in 1908. This is important because it makes the first affordable car for most Americans who can buy them. He's going to drastically cheapen the cost by using a very efficient assembly line system, and we're going to see car culture explode in America. We also have new technologies like the radio, movies, home appliances. FDR is famously going to have his fireside chats where he talks directly to Americans about what's going on in World War II and the Depression to comfort and to campaign to get reelected. We also have home appliances affecting the woman's role. We see some women getting out of the home and working because of these new time-saving appliances, but we also see the expectation of what women should do at home increase, and ironically, some women actually have more work to do because of these new appliances in their houses. We also have, as far as technology goes, the Manhattan Project. You should know that the government is going to spend a massive amount of money building these bases all over North America in an attempt to figure out how to build an atomic bomb. You guys should know that Los Alamos is the base where they break the code, so to speak, and discover how to create an explosion using a nuclear bomb there. And those new bombs will eventually be used in Japan. Now, as far as culture goes and reform, we have progressivism, okay? We have Ida Tarbell publishing The History of Standard Oil Company, where she's going to show Americans how Standard Oil has abused its power, how it's bad for America, and how the government should break up that monopoly. We have The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, published in 1906, where he shows just how disgusting meat packing plants are in America, how there's no regulations, how there's rats in the sausages, and things like that. And so that is going to convince the government to pass the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act. So that's very progressive movements, right? The government stepping in and regulating businesses. We also see the 18th Amendment in 1919, which is basically prohibition, okay? This is going to outlaw and ban the sale of alcohol in the United States. And as you guys know, it is famously a failed experiment. We see speakeasies pop up, which are illegal bars. We see organized crime with Al Capone, where these guys are bootlegging liquor and selling it illegally on the streets. In some areas, drinking actually goes up during Prohibition because these speakeasies are so popular with Americans. We also have the 21st Amendment in 1933, which is going to undo that 19th Amendment and it's going to allow alcohol back in the United States. You should also know about Theodore Roosevelt's Square Deal, where he emphasizes the 3 C's: conservation of natural resources, control over corporations, and consumer protections. So you can see that progressives on the ground are publishing books trying to get the government to regulate business. And you can see that Theodore Roosevelt is going to step in and push this Square Deal, these 3 C's, to help America move in that direction of regulating businesses and using that government power to help the small guy. We also have the first Red Scare. Okay? This goes back to all these unions forming during the progressive movement. A big one called the Industrial Workers of the World. If you know your communist literature, you know your Karl Marx, that sounds very communist, okay? All workers uniting globally. That is very scary if you're an anti-communist American. And so organizations like the IWW are going to lead to the Palmer Raids in 1919 and 1920. Now, in these Palmer Raids, they're going to arrest some 3,000 suspected communists and anarchists, and they're going to deport a massive number of these people, trying to get the communist, or the perceived communist, filth out of America. And these raids, Hoover, before he's president, is part of these raids. They are kind of going against the First Amendment, I would argue, of freedom of speech and beliefs. So know about those. That is the first Red Scare. Now, in 1911, we also have the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. This is an important episode in the U.S. history. We have 145 workers die in a factory up here on the top floor of a building. Now, the doors in this factory were locked from the outside. There's very little ventilation. There's basically no worker protection in the factory, and this fire is going to lead to reform movements for workers, so a little bit more of that progressive movement. Moving away from workers, we have the Scopes Monkey Trial, 1925. There's a teacher in Tennessee who wants to teach his kids about evolution, and Tennessee is going to block him from doing that, and he will try to push to be allowed to teach evolution in schools. And eventually he will lose that case, but it's important because it shows that Americans, especially in the cities, are moving more towards science instead of religion. And ironically, it's actually going to popularize the idea of evolution in America because it's a big published controversy at the time. You should know, during the Great Depression, we have the bonus army, where these World War I vets are going to want their bonus they were promised for fighting in World War I. They're going to march on Washington, and they're going to protest in Washington, D.C., and Hoover is going to famously send troops to kick them out. These troops, by the way, are armed with real guns. They have tanks even that they roll into these World War I vets and force these vets to scatter and leave Washington. So you can see how Hoover is not a very popular president as far as our presidents go. You should know about Dr. Seuss and his anti-Hitler and anti-Japanese propaganda he produces at the time. He's often kind of bagging on America First, which we'll talk about here in a second, but know Dr. Seuss as kind of a pro-democracy, anti-fascism character here in America. We also have the America First Committee. Okay, This is a group of Americans that are against the U.S. joining World War II. They are isolationist. They say that it's not our problem what's going on in Europe, and we should mind our own business. Two big boys in America first are Charles Lindbergh and Henry Ford. Lindbergh is the guy famous for flying across the Atlantic. And Henry Ford is obviously the Model T guy. He will even receive an Iron Cross from the Nazis before the U.S. joins World War II. So know the America First Committee and their isolationist ideas.
Came up and he was gone with the draft. He's in the army now, a-blowing.
Now, what about the federal government and its relationship with states and individuals? We see during World War I, the Espionage and Sedition Acts get passed that is going to limit Americans' rights, okay? What the Espionage Act says is it's illegal to interfere with military operations. And there's a famous case, Scheck versus United States, 1919, where a guy is distributing flyers that says you should dodge the draft, it's not constitutional, this is not what America's all about. And the Supreme Court is going to say that actually his free speech can be limited under the Espionage Act because we need to protect military operations. This idea, this Espionage Act, is not very popular at the time. We also have the Sedition Act of 1918. That makes it illegal to criticize the U.S. government or the military, again, kind of limiting that free speech, that free press, and that scares a lot of Americans at the time because it sounds an awful lot like a dictatorship limiting free speech, so know about those two acts. We also have the 17th Amendment, which I mentioned before. This allows the direct election of senators. It used to be that the states would use their legislative branch to choose the national senators. The 17th Amendment lets Americans vote directly for those senators. So during Unit 7, we see a limiting of free speech and free press a little bit. But we do see Americans being allowed to directly elect their representatives.
Came up and he was gone with the draft. He's in the army now, a-blowing.
Turning points in this unit. A big one is the U.S. joining World War I in 1917. This is a big turning point because it is America kind of folding and not being isolationist, getting into global affairs, using our big military and our big industry to go fight against the Germans. The crash of 1929 is obviously a massive turning point in U.S. history. It's going to plunge us into the Great Depression until World War II begins and we start producing and selling goods. When Pearl Harbor happens, that is a big turning point, the first time we are attacked on our own soil. And it's also going to see the U.S. joining World War II and our economy booming even more. And we also have the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, 1945, a big turning point because after that bombing, America becomes, without a doubt, a new world power, the only power to have nuclear bombs for at least a few years after 1945. And those two bombings really just show how much power America has on the world stage at this point in history. Subperiods of Unit 7, we have the Progressive Era, the 1890s to 1920s, where we see the government using its power to start regulating business. We have World War I, where U.S. is going to join in the later years of the war, and our fresh troops are going to lead to an Allied victory. We have the interwar years, 1918 to 1939, where we have the Roaring Twenties, we have the Great Depression, the New Deal, all that stuff, and then the Great Depression will come to an end with World War II, where America will join late, and those fresh troops will once again win the war for for the Allies. As far as change and continuity goes in Unit 7, we have a ton of changes for U.S. history. First off, the U.S. military is going to expand at an enormous rate. Americans will start to get comfortable with the idea of a standing army, and we have the new military-industrial complex, which is basically our economy is kind of being run by military production. It's a big part of our GDP, and it's kind of on its own path. America cannot stop producing military goods after World War II. The U.S. is also going to become a global superpower economically and militarily. Our economy is going to boom and skyrocket and become the biggest economy in the world for a long period of time. Our military is still the biggest military in the world, or at least the most powerful, so that is a very important change. We also see the federal government beginning to regulate the economy, right? We have the Federal Reserve, we have trust busting. The federal government is really going to get involved in regulating what happens as far as business goes in America. We see that natives are gaining independence. The federal government is going to take the stance that they should run their own affairs. We see women along the same vein gaining rights at this time, getting the right to vote, forming organizations to educate each other. They're going into the workforce. And finally, we see that isolationism is over, okay? The U.S. is going to join the UN. There will be a long-standing Cold War after this time period, and so we see that U.S. isolationism is over. But what is continuous? African Americans in the South are still oppressed. That won't change until 1965, so keep that in mind for the test. African Americans are still very oppressed with those Jim Crow laws in the South. So, characterization. How would you guys name this period? How would you characterize it within the greater U.S. history? Is it the most important unit in the formation of America? Is it less important than, say, Unit 2, where we have the American Revolution and things like that? Interesting ideas to think about. How would you characterize Unit 7? Now, some cool stuff you guys should look out for this unit. There is oil drilling, a movie called There Will Be Blood, a fantastic film about oil drilling and kind of the drama that happens with people prospecting land and competing for resources in the West. As far as World War I goes, we have Flyboys, which is okay, but check that one out. We have oversimplified, making World War I simple for you guys to understand. Roaring Twenties, Great Gatsby, you probably saw that in your English class. World War II, Mudbound is an excellent film about an African American vet who comes back to his family in the South, and you get to see how an African American vet is treated under Jim Crow. We have The Rise of Evil, if you want to learn more about Hitler's rise to power. We have Pearl Harbor, a good movie about that attack. Hacksaw Ridge, again, more World War II battle stuff. Saving Private Ryan, you guys know that one. Patton is excellent. And finally, the Holocaust, Schindler's List, if you want to know more about that event. Now that is the end of part 2 for Unit 7. I hope you guys are studying up on your content, filling out those review sheets, staying healthy during this time of crisis. I will see you guys in the next video.